All right, y'all, welcome back. This is going to be the beginning of Unit 2. So, this should be Lecture 4, and this is going to be based on Chapter 4 from the first book. Chapter 4 is Economic Analysis of Energy Investments. Again, there's a lot of like deep economics and deep modeling and this kind of stuff. I'm going to leave that mostly to y'all. I don't really know that you need to know the deep sort of modeling stuff, but I would say a caveat on that is that um, the energy industry is a lot based on mathematics and economics, right? So, in that sense, try and at least learn the basics of how the models work, supply and demand, these sorts of things, right? Okay. Section one's the intro, and in this chapter, I'm mostly going to focus on the firm and government investments rather than the household stuff, right? All right, so section 4.1.1 characteristics of energy sector investments. We should know that there are lots of different investments that can be made for private companies or governments or cooperations between companies and governments, etc. So this is anywhere from the sort of drilling platforms and the technology involved, also the labor costs, right, for the expertise that is necessary for the geologists, and the survey equipment, all this sort of stuff. Specialized storage units for crude and for liquid natural gas. The specialized ships that are necessary for transport across the oceans, especially for natural gas, which is compressed, right? And so if you get an explosion or something, it's going to be devastating, right? So you got to have sort of specialized equipment. Refining facilities are very expensive, right? And the maintenance and upkeep is also very expensive. Pipelines for distribution. Some of you who did the sort of follow a barrel from extraction to gas station, saw that pipelines will run you about $1.5 million, $3 million a mile, right? So these things are not cheap. You got infrastructure projects like wiring, of course, the transmission systems that are necessary, um, electrical plants, all of these sorts of things that actually produce electricity for sort of residential consumption or business consumption. Solar and wind farms are expensive, at least up front. We'll talk about that some. You also have like permitting issues, right? So land use, who has the rights to minerals if we're talking about extraction or rare earths, um, all of these sorts of things. And then, like I mentioned earlier, sort of the maintenance and the technological advancement that's necessary for all of these things too. So you also have to put some money, at least, if you're a private government, a private corporation or a government, into R&D, right? So that you can be improving and be competitive in the long term. All right, enough about all the stuff. I'm sure there's plenty more stuff we could invest in, right? Um, we should point out that energy can also be a bit of sort of a special case, right? Because the cost of entry is just so extraordinarily high, but also you have to sort of pay the costs and build out before you get any sort of return. And not all sort of companies are like that, right? Um, so this is a lot like sort of the airline industry, which is very monopolized, right? Just because of the extraordinary sort of buy-in that you have to put in up front, right? Okay, some of the special characteristics of energy investments are capital intensity, like we're talking about. It takes a lot of money, no matter what sort of level of the process you are at. Um, it's usually very high in at any level of the thing, and it can also really cost. Um, something I want to point out is that say you don't pay for the upkeep and maintenance and these sorts of things, or you go cheap in implementation, well, it can cost you a lot more in the long run. So if you look at something like the LA fires, right? where the utility companies are going to be sort of on the hook for all of the damage done, right? And so that sort of thing needs to be considered too. Um, I also want to point out that this is usually, and we'll talk a lot more in this unit about sort of why this industry tends to get sort of monopolized at every level, and then especially geographically concentrated areas like regional monopolies. But part of that is because of the high cost of investment up front, right? Um, this is often why we get government subsidization of some of these energy companies, their extraction techniques, tax breaks, all sorts of things like that. Because yes, we do want some of these services provided, obviously, right? But it's really difficult to sort of buy in or convince investors to throw in the capital. And so oftentimes the government will step in and offer some money to allay the cost, right? And this is also, I guess I would point out too, with capital intensity, this is why we get a lot of foreign ownership when it comes to developing states. Um, because foreign sort of corporations have more trust with maybe investment firms, hedge funds, whatever it might be. Um, and they're more likely to be able to sort of eat the cost and pay back the debt if something goes wrong. And so there's all these different reasons why developing countries, especially, have high foreign ownership of a lot of these sort of investment companies, unless the government is involved. Okay. The second weird thing about sort of energy investments is capital specificity. Um, there are other industries that are sort of outside of energy where capital can be more easily transferred, right? So if you think about something like agricultural, right? Tractors could be used on a different farm. Fertilizers can be used on many different crops. Um, just sort of capital can be used any different way. Um, whereas in the energy industry, often they are very, very specific. So if a company goes bankrupt, only another energy company could use that asset. So this makes investors a little bit more wary sometimes about uh, uh, putting up capital for these investments, right? Another one that I would say is like think of a building, right? A building can be used for numerous different functions. It's a lot less specific than like a drilling platform, right? So, an insurance company, maybe a hospital, maybe a university, maybe just a agglomeration of different companies can use buildings in different ways, right? And so that's a much less specific asset. All right. The third weird thing about sort of energy investment is the long lifespan of their assets, right? And so this can actually be a good thing, right? Because it can suggest that, okay, maybe these giant investments might be worth it because we're going to get, say, 100 years out of a dam that is built well, or, um, these sorts of things. Um, but it can also make sort of the analysis of the economics of the entire project really difficult. I would say 15 years ago, there were thoughts that like inflation wasn't really a thing in the developed world. And then we hit COVID, supply line difficulties, all of these sorts of things, right? And so obviously, inflation has had an effect, right? And the higher the level of inflation, sort of the less valuable money is, right? And so these sorts of things can have really big effects on, say, a 50-year energy project that is very hard to analyze long term. And so, generally, instead of saying, like, well, this is probably what we'll get on our investment over 3 years, they're like, well, here's a range of what could happen over 30 years, right? Okay. Um, they kind of show a graph of just how sort of a basic modeling of how these energy investments tend to work in figure 4.2. it's just a nice visualization of like, look, we got to dump all of this asset, organizational planning, construction phase, all of these sorts of things. Um, and then we won't really be seeing a return until years down the road, right? And so, yeah, a lot of energy projects are like this. Let's see. I would also say like this is also uh, yet another reason sort of taps into that idea that these energy projects or the energy industry tends to get a little bit monopolistic or oligopolistic just because of the giant not only investment that is necessary but sort of the waiting period that your company has to be able to survive when you're not getting an ROI, right? While you're sitting and waiting for the build out. And this is some of the problem with, I guess it's not really energy, but like the chips and the sort of Chips and Science Act that the Biden administration passed. Is it's going to take many, many years for that sort of stuff for any chips to actually get made, right? Like maybe a decade. They're already sort of pushing back projections and so, yeah, these sorts of things can make it really difficult to survive when the investment is so enormous. Let's see. I guess also I should point out, you always have to sort of relativize future income, right? Like I was sort of talking about earlier, the interest rates, or excuse me, inflation rates and inflation rates affecting the value of money, right? And so the value of a dollar 10 years from now is obviously going to be less than the dollar that you put in today, right? Um, so those things have to be considered, right? And so we just have to standardize it to a particular year's currency value in general, is what happens. Okay. Section 4.2, investment criteria, net present value, and internal rate of return. So these are just sort of introductions to ways of understanding how they actually make calculations about whether a potential investment, first of all, will be profitable, and then second of all, is useful against other potential investments, right? Because there are also opportunity costs to be considered. Um, which is why generally, you see movement in things like the stock market versus just plopping your money in a bank, right? Because there's more risk in the stock market, but there's also generally a bigger return, whereas a very safe investment only is going to feed you back, say, 2% or whatever, right? And so those are the opportunity costs that you pay and so you have to not only calculate are the projects profitable, but which project do we go with, right? Okay. Let's see. The net present value, the NPV, is just it's basically just your cash flow over time, and then they use a discount rate to adjust for the value of dollars over time. Um, the internal rate of return is, they say here, the value of the discount rate that sets the NPV of a specified project equal to zero, right? So we're balancing things out, and we ought to know if the IRR is greater than sort of the cost of capital over time, then it's going to be a good investment, right? And so don't worry too much about like the nitty gritty of these things. Just know like these are good examples of ways that the industry looks at whether an investment is a good investment or not, right? So if you go further into sort of economics or graduate school, that sort of thing, or into the oil industry, the purchasing and supply side, these sorts of things, you should know how they do these analyses. Okay, section 4.2.2, the cost of capital. So usually, again, they try to standardize these things to a particular dollar value at a particular year, right? So that's what the WACC is basically the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital. It's basically them just tying it to a particular value, right? Um, It is made up of calculations of equity versus debt, right? Like, do we want to pay out dividends? And how much is that going to cost us over time if that's the way that we get money, right? Because companies basically have two different options. They can sell stock to draw up money from investors, right? And then they pay back dividends over time on company performance. Or they can just borrow and pay an interest rate back, right? And so um, you pay what you borrowed, and then you pay a fee, the interest rate of, right now it's pretty high because the interest rate is high because of inflation, things like that. But this is a way for you to determine how best to appropriate your money or the investment you'll need between sort of equity and debt, right? Okay. Section 4.2.3, the importance of discount rates in investment decisions. So, again, this is just a really nice simplistic way of showing you in Table 4.1 and in Table 4.2 sort of how very small adjustments in costs, generally due to debt or the value of a dollar, right, due to inflation, can affect returns, right? And so a discount rate of 1% brings them a profit on this 30-year project or 20-year project, whereas the discount rate of 5% leads to a $200 million loss, right? And so these sorts of things, you have to be very aware of how you calculate these long-term debt obligations and the value of money, which is very difficult to do, right? It's easier when you're on a 10-year timeline or a 5-year timeline or something like that on your car, even though, these things can make adjustments. But 30 to 50 years is really difficult, right? Okay. Section 4.2.5, types of risk associated with investments in the energy sector, right? And there's a couple different ways that risks can be involved in these big projects, right? Construction risks, these are pretty famous, right? There's there's even like movies and TV shows like The Sopranos where the unions get involved and they slow everything down and costs rise and all these sorts of things, right? So these are, just delays and technical problems and overruns of costs, which is kind of, that also happens, and governments and companies get very frustrated about that sort of thing. You have cost risks, right? So this is anytime like the government puts in new safety standards or labor standards, or I don't know, the fuel goes up, 50% over a 5-year period, or any of these sorts of things, right? So you have cost risks. You have market risks. This is oftentimes competition from a different kind of technology. And so if you're talking energy market here, this would be petroleum, and sort of hydrocarbons, being concerned about the percentage of power being contributed by like solar and geothermal and hydro and these sorts of things, right? And so all of those different industries have to compete against each other to produce the lowest cost kilowatt hour, basically, of electricity or whatever it might be, right? And then you have policy risks too. So this is, again, this could be different changes in regulations that don't necessarily affect direct costs, right? Or it could be like environmental standards or things like this. Okay, let's see. Section 4.3, the levelized cost of energy. So this is a pretty interesting little section. It's just about sort of how do we measure energy output across all of these different industries, really, and which projects sort of get a better rate of return than others, right? And so there are some. I've kind of flipped mine on the side so it's all up and down, right? Um, And things like nuclear are cheap, right? But there's not a lot of data out there. Residential solar, especially in the Western world, which has kind of blocked out like Chinese cheap panels, is really costly on the other end, right? And so it's just a kind of a cool way to see how um, the rate of return on these different infrastructure projects over time. All right, section 4.4, the learning curve. So this is just basically the idea that costs come down, right, as technological advancements are made, but also as technology becomes more ubiquitous, right, and they have to sort of start manufacturing new technologies at scale, right, which can also bring down costs. And this is for the most part true, right? There is a limit eventually. Of course, you're going to sort of run up against a limit where you're not going to get any more cost savings eventually, right? Like everything's on a curve. But the learning curve is for the most part true. It's kind of tied to the idea from computer science of Moore's law, right? Where like every 2 years you double the amount of like computing space per square inch of microchip or whatever it might be, something like that. I'm not a computer scientist, but it's kind of that same idea, right? Where technological advances lead to efficiencies. But some tech does call this into question, right? There are some technologies where it doesn't necessarily work like that, or at least we haven't really seen it work like that yet. One that I would point out is quantum computing. It's just like eating up money and it's not really doing much that we know of as yet. I've been reading up on it for like 10 years. Kind of the same with AI, right? Like, first of all, I don't really know that AI is quote unquote artificial intelligent. It's just more like better computing. But also, um, we're not really seeing like these efficiencies of scale because we're just seeing never ending demand, right? For data storage, facilities, data itself, especially energy, right? Because of the calculation power and all of these sorts of things. And so it, it'll be interesting to see sort of how economists approach that in the coming decade or so, whether we're actually getting these sort of learning curve efficiencies. Yes, we were getting them on things like microchips, but not necessarily on the energy side of things, right? Where they're just soaking up more and more and more and more energy. Okay, section 4.5 is the social cost benefit analysis. So they're just saying basically here, like, be thoughtful about the idea that a lot of times governments and boardrooms, especially in corporate entities, don't really think about the negative externalities of their project, of their products, right? And even some news like came out today, I think it was, from the Guardian out of London, where ExxonMobil was funding, misinformation in South America against, climate change, these sorts of things, right? And so, like, not only do they not sort of take these negative effects into their cost benefit analyses, but also they sometimes they spend money to convince you that those negative externalities don't exist, right? So, yeah, they're I guess the authors are just saying like, be cognizant that. Um, a lot of times this is why you need regulations, right? Like if you look at the industrial era, that's where we got like labor and environmental regulations and stuff. And sure, like sometimes they do go too far, but kids were losing their fingers, in machines before we had any of them. So, I don't think like just getting rid of regulations is a good idea either, right? Everything's a nice balance. So, um, they're just saying, some of these models need to take, I guess, some social costs into consideration. And there actually have been some attempts in recent years, and even I guess I would say this is sort of some of the impetus behind like state parks and like national forest reserves and these sorts of things, right? That like environment has value. Um, so yeah, all right. Section 4.6, issues in developing country. We've talked about some of these issues in the former unit. I guess I'll touch on them a little bit again, but a lot of times, like these states don't really have full access to power, especially the further you get from sort of wealth or from an urban center, right? So if you live in the hinterland or a rural region or whatever, you're going to have a lot less access, right? We get a lot of sort of brownouts or poor supply or blackouts for different periods of time. And we are seeing more sort of decentralization of energy in a lot of these places. We'll sort of talk about some of that in the next section, I think. But you're seeing even some really sort of small scale um, solar technology and things like that. With microfinancing and microloans, or even just sort of small communities all contributing to sort of buy a very small energy source. So it's kind of interesting to see how some of these places are approaching access to energy. Right. All right. Thanks for being here. I'll see you for the next one soon. Have a great day.